The content in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only. Whilst we love unpacking psychological research and evidence-based insights to support well-being, this podcast is not a substitute for personal mental health care or therapy. Nothing we say should be taken as individualized advice. If anything you hear brings up concerns for you, we strongly encourage you to speak with your GP, psychologist, or another qualified health professional. You deserve support that's tailored to you.
We would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation on which this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their rich history and honour the ongoing connection to land, waters, culture, and community.
Welcome to This Might Help, a podcast bridging the gap between evidence-based psychology research and your everyday life.
We're your hosts, Dr. Lauren Rossetti
And Dr. Kira Hart.
and we are two Australian psychologists.
Today we're talking all things self-care.
Lovely. We're getting stuck into it, all about self-care. But before we do so, like normal, let's do our wellbeing win and wobble. So Kira, what is yours for the week?
I totally forgot about our wellbeing win and wobble, and I just opened up my notes for the content of the episode. But no, you're right. Back to wellbeing win and wobble. My wellbeing win, I've had a few this week, but I want to speak to this wellbeing win follows up from a wellbeing wobble I had the other week that I was trying to clear my emails in my inbox.
I remember.
And I can report back saying not only have I cleared my iCloud inbox so that I literally only have 4 emails sitting there in my entire inbox because everything else is either deleted or organized in a folder.
Wow.
I also just went through my whole Mac and just deleted a bunch of documents I'll never open again, deleted a bunch of photos that I'll never look at again, and like removed everything from my desktop. Everything's in a folder and it feels like I have a new laptop even though I don't. So it was a fresh start for me this week for my laptop.
Computer cleanse.
Exactly, computer cleanse.
That's very self-caring of
Yes. Very topical. And then my wellbeing wobble, maybe I'll speak to, I had a difficult conversation with someone during the week and I was met with like a little bit of pushback, or I had, I suppose, my like opinion was challenged. Yeah. And I definitely sat with like a little bit of discomfort during that conversation. And sometimes those can be tricky or awkward conversations to have. But walking away from it, I can reflect and then I can be like, no, like that uncomfortableness I really learned and grew from the conversation. So that was my wellbeing wobble, but it's not that bad. Uncomfortable conversations, they're the ones we learn the most from.
And it was kind of a growth moment too, a little bit.
Yes.
So a bit of a wellbeing wobble to win.
Yeah.
Mine are quite short and sharp for the week, I would say.
Yeah.
So my wellbeing win is that I got one of my papers published and out into the world. And that's always, thanks to the claps, that is always nice to see happen because they are like, obviously a lot of work and often go on for quite a bit of time. So it's nice to see them out in the world. And I am trying to do more of the celebrating my achievements.
Yes.
So that's something I'm trying to actively practice.
Yeah.
And so this is a part of that.
Huge victory.
And then my wellbeing wobble is related to book club, which I spoke a bit about on the last episode as well, and how much I love book club. But also I have not finished the book from last month.
Okay.
So I went to book club and I hadn't finished the book, but I enjoyed the conversations about the book. I had all the intention of finishing it, but have just really not got around to giving myself enough time at night to get my reading in. And so now we're approaching the next month's book club, and I have yet to open that book and start reading it. So that's my wellbeing wobble. But I'm hoping that saying it here now is motivation enough for me to finish that book.
Yeah.
So hopefully next time we record, I can come back and say my wellbeing win is that I finished the book.
Well, I might come to your book club next month. So I will also start reading the book. And hopefully we can motivate each other.
Yes, great.
When we're not recording this podcast, we'll be reading a book.
So let's get stuck into self-care then, shall we?
Yes, let's do it. So self-care, it's a term that's thrown around everywhere. Like I see it in marketing, I see it on social media so much. I feel like it's a term just in everyone's everyday vernacular.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what does self-care actually mean? Like if we consider the psychology behind it and look at self-care from an evidence-based lens, what do we mean by self-care?
Great question. There are, I guess, different definitions. There's one from that research lens that really talks about how self-care is the ability to care for yourself through awareness, self-control, and self-reliance to achieve, maintain, and promote optimal health and well-being. Now, there's a lot of words in that, but essentially what that definition is emphasizing is that we are actively engaged in our self-care, and that this involves a few things. So it involves being aware, so like knowing what you need, so awareness of what you actually need to look after yourself, self-control in the sense of making intentional choices to look after your well-being through self-care, and then self-reliance, so also taking responsibility for your well-being. And these characteristics of self-care from this research and psychology perspective look at responding to your actual physical, mental, and emotional needs. So you're responding to those needs. You're being aware of what they are, and when you engage in self-care, you should feel rejuvenated and like better able to approach or handle challenges, and it should decrease stress over time. So it's really like an intentional commitment to well-being, and that, I guess, is a bit in contrast with that social or like kind of pop culture self-care definition of being like
face mask.
Yeah. And like products you are buying, or like, like I guess kind of like sweet treat is a thing at the moment.
Yeah.
And like, whilst that can be an element of what we're talking about today with self-care, it's like, I think on social media, it can be popularized as this thing you're consuming or doing, rather than the actual research and psychology definition of self-care is really being aware of your physical, mental, and emotional needs and actually being able to address them. So being able to actively engage and provide those things that you need to look after your well-being. And then from that, there's this element of active and passive self-care. So this active self-care is kind of that hard work of learning about yourself and caring for your well-being. So things like setting appropriate boundaries, developing like your skills, or kind of that therapy-based work or like internal work, thinking about kind of what you need, exercise, goal setting, and challenging like negative thoughts and emotions that you have. So that requires that ongoing involvement and effort, and that produces these long-term changes that support your well-being, and that can feel challenging. So that active self-care, like setting boundaries, exercising, setting goals, like those things, they can feel challenging. They're not easy to do.
They require work.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the active self-care part. And then passive self-care is more talking about those restorative activities that kind of increase your energy or like reserve your energy. So things like mindfulness or meditation, these are relaxation activities, those like kind of self-care, like, taking a bath or reading a book, sitting down, having a cup of tea. So they're more of those temporary restoration and restful activities that you do.
Yeah.
But both of those types of self-care, so the active self-care and the passive self-care, kind of go together to make like a comprehensive approach to self-care.
I'm just thinking the two self-care practices that I do most commonly, one's active and one's passive. So exercise is a major one that I do, which is active. And then my second biggest self-care strategy that I implement is just sleep and like getting enough sleep, which is that more passive self-care.
Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to distinguish between is I like to think about, we have self-care strategies and then there's also self-comfort strategies.
Yeah.
So sometimes we might do something in the name of self-care. And I understand this is an audio medium. I'm kind of doing quotation marks.
Well, the YouTube viewers will see it, so that's fine.
Exactly. Like, for instance, eating a block of chocolate is really like comforting and might boost your mood in the moment, but long term it doesn't have that positive impact on your well-being. Whereas when we consider self-care strategies, they do have that long-term positive impact on your emotional, mental, and physical health.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say at the beginning of our discussion on self-care is that self-care looks different for everyone. And I don't want anyone listening to this podcast to think that practicing self-care is adding things to your to-do list, because that's not what it's about. If anything, self-care should be making life easier for you. And it's understandable that for some people, they have a certain number of hours in the day where they can practice self-care. Other people aren't afforded that same time. Maybe they have more people who are dependent on them. Maybe they're working longer hours, or they have really strict deadlines that mean for a certain period of time, practicing some of the strategies that we'll suggest today aren't feasible. And if that's the case, that is okay. You can practice self-care in so many different ways. And maybe if you don't have 20 minutes to take a bath or 30 minutes to go for a walk because your day is hectic, maybe self-care looks like showing yourself grace, showing yourself self-compassion, and just being understanding that it's a really busy time for me. I don't have time to do a self-care strategy that I would like to, but I acknowledge that it's a difficult time and I'm showing myself compassion.
Yeah. And for you, Kira, how do you define self-care in your own life at the moment? I know you spoke about exercise and sleep being two really important elements of self-care for you, but how has self-care like generally looked, or how have you approached it?
Self-care, I suppose it's something that I've worked on over the last few years. Had you asked me 5 years ago what I did for self-care or how I conceptualized it, I honestly just would have been like, I don't know, like, what is self-care? But now it's something I am quite conscious of. I suppose in the line of work we do, working as a psychologist, it's a really important thing that we implement throughout our work to make sure that we're able to look after ourselves so that we can provide best care for our clients.
Yeah.
So I have like a self-care routine inbuilt within my workday, but outside of work, I have those like habits or things that I like to do each day, like exercise or eating well to maintain to meet the needs, to meet my emotional needs, my mental health needs, and my physical needs as well.
Yeah.
What about you?
You were just about to forget to ask me.
I was just thinking about myself, reflecting in my own life. Sorry, Lauren.
Okay.
What about yourself? How do you define self-care in your own life?
Yeah, I think I've had a tricky relationship with self-care, and I think that probably comes from putting a lot of emphasis on performance and output, and having that as kind of like a value. If anyone can go listen to our values episode, but having that as something that is quite important to me. And I think when that is the case, that can become a barrier of engaging in self-care. I think it's like now it's still like a pillar of my life. And like you said, it's very important in our line of work that we are kind of looking after ourselves to look after others. But also I think for the industry that we're in, like psychology and any healthcare, or people that work in those caring roles will probably relate to this. So like teachers and healthcare workers and many others that are caring, parents also caring for children. In those roles where you're giving a lot, it can be hard to also give to yourself. Like it can be hard to kind of build those habits and barriers to kind of engage in self-care, which I think is something I've had trouble with before. I think now I have some key things, like you also mentioned, exercise is a really big one for me in kind of maintaining my self-care. And I find that very, like I notice a difference if I'm not kind of engaging in that regularly. Yeah. And then kind of food and sleep as well sometimes. But just I think also I'm a big one for like social things. So I think that often I, engage in a lot of social like catch-ups, and that kind of fills up my cup as well.
Love that.
We know that self-care is looking after ourselves and doing kind of some of these active things that involve like being aware of what our needs are and addressing them, and also some of those more passive self-care activities. But when we do those things, what is actually happening in our brains and bodies? So when we engage in self-care, what's happening that is, I guess, resulting in those benefits?
In short, a lot of the self-care practices we do, such as relaxation techniques or exercise, eating well, getting enough sleep, these all play roles in regulating our nervous system and reducing stress. So there's all these endorphins or chemicals such as dopamine involved, which helps us feel less stressed, brought about by self-care. Speaking of physical changes, when you practice self-care, have you noticed anything in yourself?
Yeah, I notice that if I am not engaging in self-care enough, or I've neglected parts of self-care that are important to me, I will feel that overwhelm in my body. So I'll feel more of that like stress response. I'll feel a little bit more of that on edge feeling, which is really like our central nervous, or like, our nervous system kind of a bit out of control. Like we're feeling that overstimulated feeling. I think that's what happens for me in my body. It's more like less self-care, higher stress, nervous system overwhelmed, and feeling a bit like frazzled.
Yes.
Yeah. How about you?
The exact same.
Just two frazzled girls out in the world. But not because we're going to engage in
practicing self-care.
I think you're doing very well, and I'm going to continue improving on my self-care practices. We know self-care is very important. We know that it's beneficial for our well-being, our physical health, our mental health, and a lot of the elements of self-care are things we already know are very good for us. So like exercise, sleep, eating well, having, appropriate rest, kind of all of those care behaviors. We know that they're great. And so why is it actually so hard to do them?
Well, the research suggests some common psychological barriers people face for implementing self-care, some of which are feelings of shame and guilt. So people may not believe that they deserve or they have done enough to practice self-care, and that might be an obstacle, that internal barrier. Research also shows that people who have perfectionistic thinking and who maintain those incredibly high standards for themselves and who derive a sense of self-worth from accomplishment, that can be a barrier for taking the time off from working and being productive to rest or relax and rejuvenate. For some people, perfectionism might make self-care feel like a weakness or a failure, or perfectionists might think that they should be able to handle everything without needing to have a break, for example, which we know isn't the case.
I think this also links in with this social pressure or expectation that self-care can be a weakness, or it can be something that's selfish to do, or that it's a luxury rather than a necessity. And I think sometimes it is seen as a luxury, or it's marketed as a luxury. So I think that there are elements of self-care, particularly the way that they're portrayed on social media, where it's something that's consumed. So like self-care is a product that can be sold and consumed by people, when we know that that's not the case. Like it's like you said, buying a face mask, or it's that you've got to have expensive skincare, or there is, 7 different expensive vitamins that you need. And unless you have all of these things, you're not taking care of yourself, when in reality, self-care, as we know from the research and the psychology perspective of self-care, is identifying what your gaps are in terms of your needs, like what needs are not being met in your well-being, and being able to address them. There are also some cognitive biases, or like these cognitive barriers, we could say, that are kind of can work against us when we're trying to implement self-care. Some of these are things like the time perception bias. So we can, I guess, people have a tendency, and I definitely have had this tendency, to overestimate how much time self-care takes.
Yes.
While underestimating the time cost of burnout and poor health. Yep. So if you completely burn out and you end up in poor health because of neglecting self-care, that obviously takes such a significant portion of time and energy and resources from you. But we have the tendency to underestimate what that cost will be, and we overestimate how much time and commitment it's going to take to engage in self-care activities. So we're less likely to take the,
half an hour walk.
Half an hour walk, even the 5-minute mindfulness meditation, or sitting down and having a conversation with a friend, or like all of those things. We're more likely to, I guess, put second, or think about them as more of a commitment than actually, if we don't do those things, there's this huge time burden of burnout and poor health that might come from neglecting your self-care.
Yes, because if you're burnt out and your productivity is 0, that's obviously a far bigger cost than taking a few minutes out of your day to look after yourself and care for yourself and relax, for example.
Absolutely. And this links into those, or this tendency for us to focus on immediate concerns way more than we would on future benefits. And this is, I guess, a much broader principle that we should also talk about in another podcast episode at some point. But we have obviously a bias for those immediate things in the moment that we'll see as urgent, and we will often address those rather than thinking about doing the things that have the longer term well-being gain. So for example, you might think like, this email is urgent and I have to reply to it right now, and you'll prioritize that over taking like a 10-minute walk around, the block and coming back to your desk. It's those I guess those immediate choices we make for something in the moment rather than thinking about the longer term well-being gain. How do we move from knowing that self-care is important to actually building that as a sustainable practice in our life?
One of the most important aspects for building sustainable self-care practices is identifying your own personal self-care needs, and these differ for everyone. So assessing what your own circumstances are and your own life context before choosing your self-care interventions. So areas which you might want to consider beyond just like work-life balance might be your mindfulness, your self-awareness, your physical health, and I know we've spoken a lot about physical health in this episode, but other aspects like your social life or spirituality and having a meaningful, purposeful life, these are areas you can consider as well. And in identifying when you need self-care strategies, it can be helpful to think about, when do you feel most depleted? So is it when you're getting home from work, or is it when you haven't seen a friend and you're lacking that social connection? And then have a think about what activities generally restore you and make you feel better rather than just distract you. So for example, you might come home from work and you might feel depleted, and you might scroll on social media. And whilst that might distract you from those feelings of tiredness, it may not be having that long-term well-being restorative impact that self-care has.
Yeah.
And so what's another activity you could do instead that has that positive well-being impact?
Yeah. And it's having that genuine reflection. So kind of that honest reflection about when things actually feel restorative and good for you.
Yes.
So it is different to do something that feels maybe satisfying in the moment. And I think this speaks to what you touched on earlier about kind of the self-comfort
strategies
versus self-care.
Yes.
So there are things that are comforting, and it's not to say that they are bad to do.
Yeah.
Like that you can engage in things that do provide comfort, and there's a place and a, time for those activities. But when we're thinking about increasing and implementing self-care, to be consistently looking at maintaining and looking after our well-being, that's when having that real honest reflection about what actually is restorative to me, and where are, like, can I swap out behaviors that maybe are more of the immediate gain, but they're not giving me that restoration. I think like in kind of our clinical work or in the psychology space, we'll often ask or talk about how like screen time, and I know we come back to that a lot, but like screen time often feels really satisfying in the moment, and because it holds your attention. So like you're engaged in it and it feels like you've got energy, and that's kind of enjoyable, but often you finish that time feeling really depleted and actually a step below from where you started. So you might have been feeling depleted before, you felt kind of engaged and kind of, you've felt these like positive immediate effects in the moment, but when that ends, you might feel even more depleted than when you started. And it's, I think, having that honest reflection on what is actually restorative. That's really important for self-care. And what for you, Kira, I'm interested in knowing if there's a flag for yourself where you know that you're kind of neglecting your self-care, or it's like a sign that something's wrong.
Yes, I have a few self-care red flags, and I have actually only noticed them recently. One of them is if I have Uber Eats for dinner more than twice a week, something's going on. Like I'm having a really busy week, maybe I'm burnt out, I'm not having time to cook myself dinner, and that's like a big red flag to me saying you need to practice some self-care, something's going on. You've ordered Uber Eats 3 nights this week. Another one is when I notice my desk messy at work or my bedroom being not tidy at home. That's another red flag to me that I need to practice self-care strategies and that there's something going on and I need to pause, take stock and do something about it. What about you? What is a flag that suggests you're neglecting self-care in your own life?
I similarly notice like messy room. So I will have like clothes in the corner that I haven't put away and they'll accumulate, or my bedside table is just getting a bit out of control. I think also I notice that I will have more difficulty with getting like up and out of bed and like, you know, I might have a aim that I want to get up at this particular time and like get to work early to start my day. And that becomes harder, I think, when I'm neglecting my self-care. I think those are two of kind of the key things for me. A really important element of setting up this routine of self-care or implementing self-care consistently into our lives is setting boundaries. And I am going to speak to this off the research background and our psychology perspective, but it is important to note that this is not something that we're, you know, immune from struggling with. And I think particularly for those of us that have a very perfectionistic nature or are very kind of productivity minded and always committing to many things, these types of boundaries can be tricky. I think, for anyone that knows me will know that I struggle to say no to things. And I think given I think given that we're both doing a podcast that's a very big time commitment and we also very much work full time, as well, that's maybe telling to this element. But regardless, boundaries are, I think, a fundamental element of establishing self-care as something that exists in our life. And for people that don't have clear boundaries, they can struggle, and I'm saying people, but this is also me, they can struggle to prioritize self-care needs over other demands that come in. So I think that's probably relatable, not just for myself, but for many other people listening, is that there can be things that come in like, you know, a social commitment you're invited to, or a job opportunity that pops up, an extra thing to be involved in. And you might feel compelled to say yes or take on all these things or do all of these things in the place of self-care. So like that taking on those things results in neglecting an element of self-care. So this is, I guess, where those boundaries are so important. An element of those boundaries are time boundaries. And this is where we allocate that specific time to engage in self-care activities without guilt or interruption. So that could be, you know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, in any shape, you know, every day, once a week. It doesn't matter. It'll look different for every person depending on kind of all the factors you spoke about earlier. You know, everyone's self-care capacity and circumstances look different. But regardless of kind of how that looks, it's thinking about allocating some time or space to have self-care or engage in self-care without the guilt or interruption. And I think for the perfectionistic people or those that really have the mindset that self-care is not something they deserve, or they feel like they can't engage in self-care without feeling shame around that, it's really blocking out time where this is guilt-free, dedicated time that I'm going to just be doing this thing for me. And that is for my self-care, and blocking that in. There are also boundaries where you are noticing that you're feeling really depleted or burnt out or needing kind of restoration, and it's putting boundaries in place to give yourself the time and space to kind of restore that energy. And then communication boundaries, which I think are probably one of the trickiest ones, is being able to say no to requests that compromise your well-being.
This is such a big one.
Yeah, and we're going to do a whole episode on saying no.
Yes.
Which is very needed. But that is obviously a huge one, in that if you take on everything and you do everything, obviously that is drawing away from the time that we have to engage in self-care.
And what's the saying? You can't pour from an empty cup.
Yes. Can you call me every morning and say that to me? Can I
try?
Yeah.
No,
maybe.
I can't. I'm putting a boundary in place. Let me sleep in.
Maybe actually what I'll get you to do is like a little voice note thing that I can have on my phone. And every morning I'll wake up and hear Kira saying to me, Lauren, you can't pour from an empty cup. And that will give me the power to say no.
That can be your alarm in the morning.
Yeah, that would be perfect. That would revolutionize my life, I think.
You've mentioned the challenge of guilt and how that can make it difficult for people to set boundaries and to follow through on their boundaries. But lots of people also struggle with fear of disappointing others or letting others down, believing that setting a boundary might be selfish. And then sometimes you might find yourself in an environment such as a workplace environment where those boundaries aren't respected or they're unable to be followed through. But we know that boundaries are really, really important in our ability to do good work and to help others, because we can't pour from an empty cup. We can't operate from a place of depletion. And putting boundaries in place requires practice and sometimes can feel a bit uncomfortable at first, but the more you do it, the better you get it. The better you get at it.
Okay, well, I'm hoping for the practice and repetition in
Yes.
improving outcomes. And practically from here, with implementing, or I guess knowing, we've talked all about this information about self-care, what it is, what we do, and what is kind of the takeaway to do in your daily life. One of those first steps is assessing your current self-care. What does self-care look like to you? Is it non-existent? Or are there elements of it that are working well? Is there elements of it that you need to improve on? So thinking about what self-care is currently looking like for you, and then thinking about your personal barriers to self-care. So is that something like perfectionism? Is it those time perception barriers, like you view self-care as something that will take a lot of time? What for you are the barriers to self-care? Then identifying one boundary that you need to set up to protect your self-care time. So just starting with one thing, one boundary you can put in place that will protect your time for self-care, and creating one intention for implementing a small self-care behavior. So maybe stepping away from this discussion and thinking about one self-care behavior or activity or act that you can do for yourself that you're going to implement into that boundary protected self-care time that you have carved out.
Amazing. So that brings us to the end of today's episode.
Lots of chat about self-care in today's episode. I think we've spoken a lot about why self-care is so important and why it's actually really hard to implement. So I think for ourselves and our listeners alike, we know it's so important to implement self-care, and we know there are lots of barriers. And I think, like you touched on earlier, Kira, it's also being gentle and kind on yourself, and also reflecting on the fact that we're all trying our best, which I think is an important message to leave this episode with.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We'd love to hear any feedback you have. So please send us a message on This Might Help Podcast, at This Might Help Podcast on social media.
The video version is on YouTube as always, and the resources and references are all in the show notes. As always, if you need any further help or support, those resources are also in the show notes for further helplines. And also please get in touch with a healthcare professional if needed.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.